Hi, government students. This is Mrs. Politsky. I have your notes for Chapter 4, Section 1, Dividing and Sharing Powers. We're going to talk a little bit about federalism today. So, to start with, we've got this matching section here, and some of the terms that we're going to look at are maybe terms that you've seen in your vocabulary. So, we're going to start with reserved powers. This is letter I. These are powers that belong strictly to the states. And when we look at, like, for example, Amendment 10 in the Constitution, which basically says that any powers that the federal government doesn't have, those remaining powers go to the states. And those are basically reserved powers. The Supremacy Clause. This is letter F. This is basically saying that the act or treaty of the United States is superior to that of any individual states. Really, the whole premises of the Constitution is that it contains this supremacy clause, meaning that whatever the Constitution is, it becomes the highest law of the land, and it supersedes anything that could happen at any lower form of government. Concurrent powers, and number 3 here is letter B. These are powers that both the national government and the state governments exercise, but they exercise independently. That could be things like taxing and such. Implied powers. Anytime that we talk about the word implied, it's not exactly written, but it is kind of assumed. And this goes with letter G. The draft is an implied power of the federal government, or the regulation of nuclear energy, or the development of the space program. All of that falls into that category. And number 5, powers denied to the national government. These are basically letter A here, taxing exports and interfering with the ability of states to carry out their responsibilities. The federal government can interfere with state governments as far as their day-to-day implementation of their laws. Number 6, we have letter E, the leveling and collecting of taxes and regulating of interstate commerce. These are express powers. These are things that you're going to find explicitly written within the Constitution. If you remember back, we talked a little bit about enumerated powers. Enumerated powers and express powers are really the same thing. The big difference is that one is specifically numbered article and section and such. But for the most part, these are things that you're going to find within the Constitution itself. And number 7, inherent powers of the national government. This is letter C. This is like controlling immigration and establishing diplomatic relations. These are things that our government really is responsible for, not so much the states, but the government. And number 8, the rule for admitting new states. This is letter D. The power of Congress to, for the most part, examine and improve state constitutions. So it is spelled out within the Constitution, the process for admission of new states, this idea that there's a certain population number, roughly around 50,000 people. They have to have a state constitution, and it has to be in line with the federal Constitution. If they meet those things and plus get approval by Congress, we can have a new state. And number 9, we have letter J. This is the guarantee made to the states by the national government. That is for a Republican form of government. And if you remember back, that means representative government. Protection from invasion from outside sources or domestic violence. If anything would happen within our states where there would be rioting, the federal government has the guarantee to the states that they will come in and protect the states, and also respecting the integrity of the borders of each state. States go out and they survey that land, and that the federal government is going to respect that. And then finally, the Enabling Act, this is letter H. This is the first step for admission of a new state into our union. This is spelled out within the Constitution as well. So all these terms are very important. A while back, we talked about kind of this model here of federalism, kind of the pyramid. At the very top, we have our national government. In the middle, we have our state governments. And at the bottom level, we have our local governments. And if we think about this maybe in terms of like a population pyramid, there are far more local governments than there are state governments, and there obviously are more state governments than the national government. But the idea is if you're wanting to get into politics, it's always easier to get involved at the local level. Okay, and it gives you an opportunity to get experience if you are so interested in moving up the pyramid. All right, we're going to talk about national government in terms of expressed and implied powers, state government when we talk about reserve powers, and then some concurrent powers of both the national and the state government. So, some expressed and implied powers of our national government, that's like regulating foreign and interstate commerce, that means business, the printing and coining of money, providing for an army, navy, or an air force, the admission of new states and to govern the territories that we establishment of post offices and federal highways, conducting foreign relations and negotiating treaties and appointing ambassadors, and then finally the establishment of the Supreme Court and all of our other federal courts. Those are all expressed and implied powers. At the state level, we have reserve powers. This is like regulating trade and businesses within a state, establishment of local government, establishment and support of public schools, the conducting of elections and setting qualifications for voters, providing professional licenses, and setting up rules for marriages and divorce. Powers that they share, or the concurrent powers, that's to levy taxes, borrow money, charter banks, protect the public health and welfare, establishing courts, defining crimes and carrying out punishments for lawbreakers, and making, enforcing, and interpreting the laws. All right. Two functions of the states that help the nation. One is that states and local governments will conduct and pay for federal elections. So, when we look at years when we have like presidential elections, it's your local and state governments that are going to pay to get those ballots out and pay to get the poll workers in to help run those elections. That definitely helps out our federal government. Another thing is when we talk about ratification of amendments, a two-thirds majority of the states is definitely needed to approve any amendment. And so that's another way that the states can help the federal government. One function that Congress has to limit the states, that is how Congress might alter some election laws if so needed. Um, in the 1960s, we had some issues with poll taxing and literacy tests, and really Congress stepped in and intervened, and eventually we had an amendment to the Constitution that forbids states from having a poll tax or having a literacy test to secure voters. All right, thank you very much.